Hey, I'm Lee Calcote. I'm coming to you today from Austin, Texas, where it is in the wee hours of the morning right now. To the extent that I go over something too quickly, or you just want to get a copy of the slides, hit that URL and you'll see these slides and some other talks that I've given. You're welcome to go through those if you want to suffer through more than you suffered today. A little bit about me. You can generally find me within this space. And actually with great pictures, like the one was taken by this gentleman, I think, at the last conference. So it was, yeah, no, he takes good pictures. Yeah, it was you. I think so. Yeah. So I'm a fan. I'm a fan. That's right. That's right. Trust me, my wife says I'm funny too. So it's, anyway, the thing is. Yeah, so reach out, poke at me. I enjoy a good nerd talk, good conversation. So don't be shy. I end up getting involved with some local meetups and some local conferences. If you're coming to the next iteration of this conference, I'll see you in Austin. I may even hand you some barbecue, and we'll have a breakfast taco together or something. We'll see. My full-time role is over at SolarWinds. How many of you guys are familiar with SolarWinds software? Monitoring software management. Yeah, very good. Are you guys running that software as well? So yeah. If you've got complaints or feedback, or if you've got complaints, you can just get, if you've got feedback, okay, good. If you've got feedback or just want to talk about the products, come see me. I'd love to talk about them. I also love to talk about what we're doing in this space. So we're doing some interesting things. But I'm here to talk to you today about AlertManager, specifically within the Prometheus project. AlertManager is one of a number of binaries that you'll find for download on Prometheus.io. So I think a number of the talks have been about Prometheus, the white box monitoring system that you know today, that scrapes metrics. Its beloved component and companion is the AlertManager. So two separate systems. Sometimes people ask why those are separate. A couple of benefits there. One is these two subcomponents can be advanced independently, so they can move at their own pace, so to speak. Also, as you go to deploy them and kind of scale them, the nice thing about having the AlertManager separate is that as you go to, you can centralize notifications going into the AlertManager and kind of do your central grouping and correlation and deduplication. There are other binaries, there are other components to the project that you'll find, which is exporters. There's a long list of exporters. Exporters are valuable to the extent that you're trying to monitor a system that isn't directly instrumented, meaning it doesn't natively export Prometheus metrics in the format that Prometheus wants to scrape them. There's another component, the push gateway, which is really intended to be used for as a metrics cache for jobs that are shorter lived and aren't necessarily always available to be scraped. I suspect some folks are maybe using the push gateway in nefarious, sort of unintended ways, for maybe breaking through firewalls or that kind of a thing. So the purpose of AlertManager is as a few things. It's as an alert ingester. So most prominently, an ingester of alerts from Prometheus. It doesn't have to be from Prometheus. AlertManager as a separate component does have all of its functionality through API. And so if you have a separate alert client and want to send in alerts from some other system, you could, so long as it's adhering to the API specification and sending in JSON of the right type and at the right frequency. AlertManager ingests alerts, but of a couple of different states. So obviously alerts that are firing, as well as alerts that have cleared or ones that have transitioned back to inactive. AlertManager also acts as an alert grouper or duplicator. So it does some correlation, both time-based and kind of label-based correlation. It does deduplicating as well of alerts. We're going to talk more about that. It's a silencer, so you can go in and mute alarms, active alarms, prevent them from being notified. It's an alert throttler. So to the extent that you've got an alert that's been notified and continues to be a problem for you, to the extent that AlertManager would continue to send notifications about those alarms, you can tell it how frequently to do that, so to throttle back those notifications. And then very clearly, AlertManager is a notifier, right? So it's notifying third-party systems of alarms that have transpired. So let's do a bit of, so no, that's not a German word, it's not Deutsch up there, but it's just nomenclature that is, I should have been more clever and used a German word. But so let's talk a little bit about some nomenclature of Prometheus, a couple of core constructs. We're going to talk about routes and receivers. These are described within the singular configuration file that you will hand AlertManager as you start up AlertManager. You describe them inside of a configuration file, which is YAML. Routes are used to match alerts, group them, and align them to a receiver. Also, they're used to identify how frequently those alerts should be notified. Receivers are the where and how to notify alerts. So a where being maybe you want to send an email to Gmail, and the how being SMTP over a certain port with TLS and your credentials. Other constructs that you're going to find inside of the AlertManager config are have to deal with muting, suppressing, and correlating. And since I have the mic, I get to take liberty with a couple of twists on words here that aren't the exact same ones you might find from those that are the actual Prometheus authorities. There's such a thing as a silence, and I'm calling it a silencer here. But so a silence is where you can go into the AlertManager UI, and for an active firing alert, just mute it, prevent it from notifications going out about it. I'm also taking liberty with the word inhibitors. You can define inhibition rules to control suppression. So really a common use case here is that there's an alert that's fired. Maybe an entire rack went down in your data center, and you go out and match a source alert. Maybe it's a critical, all systems down, hair on fire thing, and you'd like to suppress all the subsequent warnings and other other messages that come through for the 500 other systems that are down. And so you'd use an inhibition rule to match and both of those, what you'd like to match against and what you'd like to suppress. So you describe that inside of the AlertManager configuration. And then lastly, really grouping is this notion that I like to think of in terms of correlating, both kind of time-based correlation as well as label-based correlation. And so you use these group by functions, again, within your configuration file. So there's a group by here where you get to correlate what alarms you'd like to put into the same group based on labels. Or you can also, AlertManager also will allow you to define things like a group wait period, which is when an alarm is firing and you receive the first notification for that alarm, for that group. It may wait, in this case, up to 30 seconds for other alarms that are in that same group before it sends out that first notification, and that way it kind of does this time-based correlation. The group interval here, in the case of 5 minutes, is sort of once you've received an alarm for a particular group and you've notified on that, to the extent that that continues to be an open alarm for some time and you're receiving additional correlated alarms inside that same group, you can kind of define how your throttle here, how frequently AlertManager will continue to notify external systems. Okay, so we talked a little bit about muting, suppression, correlation, some other kind of approaches to suppression. So we talked about silences, and creating silences in the UI. You can, anything you can do in the UI, you can do through the API. And so there's a use case here maybe for creating silences as you were to have a maintenance window. Maybe you kick off your maintenance script, and one of the things it does is it goes out and creates silences using the API. And then when the maintenance window is done, you go in and use that same script to remove those silences. That's a use case. I think you'd hear folks argue maybe you shouldn't be creating alarms during your maintenance window anyway, but So we talked about inhibitions and the fact that those are globally described. That use case of you having a critical alarm that's firing, you know that, and you don't need to be flooded with a million other alarms, so you're suppressing other alerts that are related. Another way of kind of approaching suppression is on a per route basis, so using the repeat interval, and that would be to the extent that Alert Manager has received an alert, it's notified on that alert to the, for that route. The repeat interval controls when the next time is that Alert Manager would notify for that same set of grouped alerts. So conceptually, if you had this repeat interval for 24 hours or some really extended period, you're in essence kind of suppressing the rest of those alerts that would come through. So kind of a couple of different ways to reduce your pager fatigue. So probably last construct here is obviously very central to what we're talking about, and that's alerts. It's a shared construct between Prometheus, that Prometheus binary, and the Alert Manager binary. Really, it's probably sort of owned by, the lifecycle of it is owned by, the definition of lifecycle is owned by Prometheus itself. So you define alerts using the syntax that you see here. Those alerts can then go into these different states and are notified to Alert Manager. The interesting state here is this pending one. I think it's fairly obvious what inactive and firing do, but this pending state is to the extent that you've got an alert defined for a given metric, and that metric begins to match this criteria, it will move from inactive to a pending state, depending upon the duration that you've described here under the for. So if it was matching CPU over a certain percentage for you'd begin to move from, and your CPU spiked over that amount, you'd move to pending and you'd hold out in pending for a minute or however long you've described that duration. And assuming that your metric has still crossed that threshold after the duration has ended, you transition into firing, and Prometheus would send a firing alarm to Alert Manager. Also, when those alerts then move back to inactive, Prometheus will let Alert Manager know that as well. And so there's this notion of you can control whether or not Alert Manager sends out resolved or clear notifications out to the third-party alert management systems, which are really these systems here. So the systems that you see with the pretty icons have kind of first-class integration into Alert Manager. The email and kind of webhook icon, if that's what, because whatever that is really represents a webhook, right? So that, anyway, those are the more generic ways of integrating with systems. It used to be that FlowDoc was up here as well. In the .5 release, that kind of fell by the wayside. I'm sure to come back. So it is possible to have Alert Manager notify to multiple destinations. Maybe you want to send an email and a webhook. So a couple of ways to do that. Probably one of the more conceptually easier ways here is to just define multiple destinations under the same receiver. So in this case, maybe you're wanting to send an email and a webhook. Alternatively, you can use the continue keyword as you describe your routes. So here what we're saying is we're getting a severity of alarm with a severity of page. We're going to send that to our operations B team. And if we continue from there, and we're matching against severities with critical, maybe that's when we call in the A team. Right? Yeah, I didn't think it was funny when I said it. So a little bit about the Alert Manager architecture, or really kind of the system flow for how an alert comes into the system and kind of the things that happen to it and actions get taken on it. This is really the non-HA version, as I understand it. So again, all things come through the API, whether it's the UI or that maintenance script I talked about, but alerts come into the API, they're ingested. Really, it's the dispatcher that takes on the job of grouping and aggregating, kind of assigning the correct notifier to a given alert. That alert gets put into a notification pipeline. We check for those inhibition rules. We check for the silencers that you may have, the silences that you may have defined, and whether or not this particular notification, this group has already been notified previously. So, try to dedupe those notifications, and then send out to your destination. The HA version ends up looking, I think you see a few more things in this notification pipeline. One of those is that after an alert has been notified, then you'll see some gossip happening here where the other alert managers in that quorum or in that same group would exchange state and understand who's notified which alerts, whether or not they've already been notified. So speaking of high availability, Frederick gave a great talk earlier on high availability. You should rewatch that one. But I loves me some gossip protocol, so I got to talk about it for a second. And this functionality is kind of built on top of Weave Mesh, which Frederick mentioned as well. Weave Mesh ends up valuing consistency in the face of a network partition. And so it's an eventually consistent gossip protocol implementation. The nice thing about high availability with Alert Manager is that it sort of eliminates the need to monitor the monitor. So to the extent that you'd had a singular Alert Manager there before, if it went down, you didn't necessarily know unless you were monitoring the monitor. And so with HA, you don't need that anymore. The other way that this system works, kind of the behavior here, is that it guarantees that you'll receive notification at least once, which is good. All right, let's crack open the history book, or let's crack open a use case around how to add a feature into Alert Manager. Let's just open up the code a little bit. So you're all probably very familiar with the Alert Manager UI. In this case, we've got a screenshot of a singular alarm that's firing. And this is an instance down. What we don't see is a bunch of context about what else has necessarily happened in this system. For this, in this case, it's an instance down. So how many times has this instance been down, or have we received this alert in the last little while, or what additional context can I use to troubleshoot here? And so let's look at what it might mean to bring in a history view and put it up there. So before we can start coding, we obviously have to have a user story. Otherwise, we can't go write the code. So as an operator, I'd like to not only see a list of firing alerts, but also a list of all transpired alerts so that I can better troubleshoot. As a little bit of a background, you can better troubleshoot if you kind of begin to define what is normal, or understand, hey, do we have a problem area here? Is this just happening every Wednesday, or what's going on? Maybe to the extent that you can see how these things have happened in the past in a certain order, you can do some crude root cause analysis. We do want to identify that we've got a limitation here. That the version of Alert Manager that we're talking about is not the HA .5 version, but is our prior versions, which we're using SQLite as their database to persist alert notifications. And so and that wasn't intended to be long-term storage, so it is a limitation. Acceptance criteria for the story would be, hey, once an alert is fired, we should be able to see all of those transpired alerts on a history page. Optionally, we should probably see that in a Slack channel. We should probably put some stretch in here and say that if we're looking at history, to the extent that we've got thousands of alerts, maybe we should have some pagination or a date picker or some kind of filters. Of course, I think we all know what stretch means. That means out of scope, right? Or ain't gonna do it. So we probably aren't. Nice thing about this user story is it only talks about affecting changes inside of Alert Manager. So it's also kind of nice that it's a separate component. To that end, we can go in and begin to set up our environment with Prometheus and some sample targets. There, as part of the Prometheus project, there's a small target written in Go that you can go out and deploy. So let's go and set up our environment. Let's go deploy one of these guys. Okay, so it's probably horrifically small. I don't know why anyone ever asks, can you see that? Like, hey, you never can see it. I don't know if I'm the only one that's blind, but it's like, no, it's always too small. It's just, yeah, you guys feel the same. Yeah, that's what okay, good. So we set up a target. We should go in and deploy Prometheus itself. So we're going to give it the config file that we want to run. We're also going to point it at our soon-to-be Alert Manager. So we'll go back. get this into a new, we'll get them up. We'll take a quick look at our Prometheus config, which is here. It's just essentially the vanilla stuff. We're going to add an external label of Cloud Native Con, most appropriate, and then also just some very simple alert rules, or actually just one alert rule, and that's here. It's just the instance down, same one that we saw in the screenshot before. So it's just hey, alert if my instance is down, if it hasn't been up for 5 seconds. Assign it a label and some additional annotation. Okay, so now that we've got our, so let's just confirm that our environment is up. Okay, yeah, so we've got Prometheus here. It is pointing to itself and scraping itself, and it's also scraping that little sample target that we put up. You can see it's trying to send some alerts right now, but not finding Alert Manager because we didn't set up Alert Manager. So let's set up Alert Manager. In this case, we need to kind of set up our development environment because we're going to get in there and make some changes. So we go out, clone the repo. I won't spoil all of our bandwidth by doing that. We'll also need to go and grab a tool that's used within the Prometheus project. It's called Go Bin Data. This tool helps you, since we're going to be messing and muddling with the UI and adding a new history view, we need to go use this tool to help us stuff in some static HTML and CSS and Angular into the alert binary, the Alert Manager binary. Also, then let's set up our Slack integration. So we're going to quickly define a route here, get that severity of page happening. We need to go create a new, probably a new channel and a new API URL for Slack. So if we go into our team, go into your team, you add a new webhook. When you do, you describe which channel it is that you'd like to send it to. In this case, that was Prometheus. You'll click to get that API endpoint, that address, get that set up. Interestingly, as you're defining your Alert Manager configuration, things can get kind of gnarly with how many routes you've got set up and who should, what should get matched and who should get notified when and where. There's a visual editor that's available on Prometheus.io where you can go and paste in your YAML configuration, and it'll visually show you what routes you take, and it'll let you kind of do some test matching to see which messages would go where. So that's been helpful to me. And then we want to get into this build, run, test cycle of making our project, building the project, running Alert Manager. So let's go run Alert Manager. We're going to just use that simple config that we looked at on the last slide. Kick off Alert Manager. Let's see if Alert Manager comes up. So we do have, let's see. Okay, so we do have Alert Manager up. That's good. A couple of other tips for folks who stumble through things like I do. To the extent that you update your Prometheus configuration or your Alert Manager configs, these are a couple different ways to reload that config on the fly. Also, to the extent that you've made changes in your Prometheus config or the alert rules, you can use Prom tool to just check and verify that they're syntactically correct before you reload and start missing alarms. Okay, so we just want to test our environment, make sure that that we're set up correctly. So we should be. So we are sitting here scraping. So we do have a silence defined. We've got our config loaded, that very simple one that we were looking at, Prometheus. And then get into the changes that we would make inside the code. So really only a few, about 6 files that need to be changed. A little bit of Go, some Angular, HTML, and some SQL. So not very much, 6 files in total to add in a new history view. So let's take a look at api.go. This is where we go out and register our handlers and their routes. So the new route that we would define here is /history. We register the handler here. We just list all alerts. That seems fairly appropriate. We go down and define what list all alert, what that function means, and tell it that it would be a new method call, a new alert iterator on the alerts object. By the way, the yellow, if to the extent that you guys come back and look at this later, a couple of notes. One is all the yellow links, all these yellow text are links to where this code is, where this tutorial is. So then having defined that API endpoint, we're going to go and define what that getAll alert iterator is. Let's open up this real quick, so just kind of prove my point that, yep, they're hyperlinks. And so we just register the getAll alert iterator here. We need to go define what that SQL query would look like if we want to pull alerts from SQLite. So not enough time to kind of go through all the code, but I'll show you guys a few snippets here. Here's the select query that we're running. Probably the takeaway here is it is sort of conspicuously missing a where clause. So it just says, you know, select these things about all alerts. Yeah, that's, you know, in a larger system, we're going to need to be a little more. We're going to have to get into that stretch goals of kind of filters and date pickers and things. But that'll do for now. Okay, so we've defined how it is that we're going to retrieve data from our database. Now we go into our Angular, into the web UI aspect, and create a new menu item called history. We'll go over and define what service that history menu item should call, what HTML we should use to format the record set that's retrieved. So just about 4 spots in our Angular, which ends up looking like this. So we do need to go over and then create a history.html so that we can identify how we're going to format that record set. In this case, in a tabular way. Let's go look at that real quick. Yeah, so you guys can see. So very simple. Hey, we'll put a little legend around alert history, and then we'll just feed in our alerts into this tabular format. Let's go back. Okay, let's go see if that happens. So we do have. So I recognize we're kind of pre-baked the cake a fair bit in here just to kind of make it through. But anyway, we do have a new history tab. We click that, and we go over. And fortunately, this is a very small system, which doesn't have a lot of alerts. But we're seeing our full history here. So we do have our Cloud Native Con alert that is fired and a bunch of other instances down. But hopefully what this does is begin to serve as kind of this simple enhancement kind of serves as an example of how to navigate part of your way through the various aspects of Alert Manager, what it might take to add something new. Certainly communicating with the core maintainers is probably the great place to start if you're going to go and add something like this, make sure it's kind of aligned with the direction of the project. We're going to point out some resources here in a minute about that, but I'll say that, again, to the extent that you want to kind of wade through what was done, there's a fork on GitHub you can go look at, as well as just maybe a better written tutorial that's it's not in slide format, but just kind of written out for you to look through. Here are just a list of resources and how to engage some of the folks that have already presented today and some of the people that are helping advance Prometheus. Some fairly active mailing lists. Fantastic. By the way, we're hiring at SolarWinds, in case that wasn't. With that, questions? I think we have time. Maybe we have time. Yes, like 6 files to be changed. Really, just the smallest amount of Go, the easiest bit of SQL. Should plant some seeds about things that maybe should be in the project. The project, I think, the caveat that I think I made earlier is that the project has since moved away from using SQLite, and is now moving towards an HA system, based on the framework that I mentioned before. But as I understand, the team does consider the need for this type of a view, and considering how they might facilitate for that at some point. Yes. Yes. Questions? Who's yes?
How did you find navigating between or how difficult or easy, or what was your experience with navigating between developing in the back end and the front end at the same time?
Yeah, just like for me personally, or like just like. Yeah, I stumbled initially with that small utility that I pointed out kind of briefly. It was and this is in part because I'm a Go noob as well. I'm going to try to bring it up. It was the small utility Go bin data. If I can find that out. Wow, why can I not? Okay, I'm not finding the slide, but anyway, it was a small utility Go bin data that I stumbled over initially. I went through, made some Angular changes, and hey, that very clearly, that thing is going to show somewhere, and for the damnedest reason, I couldn't figure out why. It's just, it's not showing, hey, this is compiling, I'm getting a new binary, but there's no changes in the UI. What's going on? I'm dumping my cache like you wouldn't believe furiously. Anyway, it was come to learn, I came to be educated on that utility itself, so that was a little bit of a gotcha for me. Other ones moving back and forth, I think I was, just for me, pleased to see that something SQL-like was being used, just given my familiarity with that query language, and that certainly made it easy. Of the type of functionality that was delivered here, it was really easy to just use other methods and other functions as examples of the right way to what was to be done. So that was really helpful. All in all, it was about it was a little less than a day to do the work, and so even though I stumbled through, it's about how long it took, or just the write-up took 3 days, but making it through was pretty short. So one of the things that I would say, maybe even to answer that question more further, is that hey, once you get into pulling back a couple hundred records and things, getting into pagination and using I'm an Angular newbie as well, so getting in and using that would be, I could start to see where it would take me longer to figure that out. Oh, by the way, on that, the team is considering moving from Angular over to Elm, kind of a proposal on the table. Maybe I'm probably talking to an insider, I don't know, but is Elm or React, and I think kind of the vote is headed towards Elm. But, yes, I'm getting some head nods. Yes, sir.
High availability, but in a multi-data center things where, I don't know, maybe gossip, eventually might not really be the solution when you need to
cross-region stuff, yeah. Or even...
It works in a single availability in a region across the zone, but what happens when you need to centralize everything in a dashboard, basically?
There's always a higher level to go, right? There's always that's a good place for maybe SolarWinds to step in and provide a solution. Hey, that's but I don't. Is it Tom? I don't know that we've met, but it's Tom. You've HA kind of Weave Mesh Alert Manager stuff. Is that your general?
But the Weave Mesh stuff was
Okay. Anyway, I was going to augment his question with the question was, hey, so let me repeat it was. So the HA stuff is fantastic within a given cluster, but as you go multi-region or on-prem, off-prem, how does that begin to work? That sounds like a lot of gossiping at a very low latency type,
What happens when your data center goes offline? You need to get an alert from a different place that's gone.
Yeah,
so
right.
If you put your alert manager
Oh, okay.
there, then how do you get the hooks or the emails?
just operationally. Moreover, to the extent that I said HA solved the need to monitor the monitor, well, that was probably true within that region, right? So, yeah, maybe a longer discussion. Yeah, it's a good. Yeah, it's a good. I don't know that the project itself necessarily like.
What we try to do is use webhooks to centralize on some place and have individually alert manager that sends, but also have kind of a central place that keeps track of everything so we get a report.
Gotcha.
It's probably how your solution works.
Nice.
Just want to see
If other folks, yeah. I don't have a crisp answer. I don't know. As a matter of fact, I recognize. I should say adieu to the folks, and I'll catch you in just a second. But thanks a bunch, guys. Thanks for.